In popular memory, American shotguns in the Pacific War are often portrayed as terrifying close-quarters weapons that devastated Japanese infantry in jungle combat. Stories describe Marines charging through foliage, unleashing devastating fire at point-blank range, overwhelming enemies who had never encountered such weapons before. This image has been reinforced by films, video games, and post-war anecdotes that elevate the shotgun into a symbol of American brutality and tactical dominance. Yet when the historical record is examined closely, a far more complicated picture emerges. The Winchester Model 1897 and Model 1912 were indeed issued to U.S. forces, and Japanese troops were aware of their existence. But fear did not arise from widespread battlefield devastation. Instead, it emerged from uncertainty, unfamiliarity, and the psychological effect of a weapon that defied Japanese expectations of how infantry combat would unfold, even if its actual combat use was far more limited than legend suggests. Japanese infantry doctrine before and during the Pacific War was built around assumptions of engagement distance, weapon type, and rate of fire. Rifles, machine guns, and grenades defined close combat. The sudden appearance of a smoothbore weapon capable of firing multiple rounds in rapid succession challenged these assumptions, at least conceptually. Shotguns were not common in Japanese service, nor were they emphasized in Japanese training manuals as threats requiring specific countermeasures. This unfamiliarity mattered. In jungle terrain where visibility was limited and encounters could occur at extremely short range, the idea of a weapon that could unleash devastating fire without precise aim carried psychological weight, even if its actual deployment was sporadic. Fear, in this case, was less about battlefield statistics and more about the unknown, how such a weapon might be used and whether existing tactics were adequate against it. However, the scale of shotgun deployment tells a different story than popular myth. While approximately 25,000 Model 1897s and between 60,000 and 80,000 Model 1912 were produced for military service, their presence at the front was inconsistent. Marine Corps authorization documents show that a standard division was allotted roughly 306 shotguns, a fraction of total small arms issued. Even then, authorization did not guarantee availability or use. Ammunition shortages plagued shotgun deployment throughout much of the war. Early paper-hulled shells performed poorly in humid jungle conditions, swelling, jamming, and becoming unreliable. The brass-cased M19 shell, which finally solved these issues, did not arrive until March 1945. Too late to influence most Pacific battles, where the shotgun myth is said to originate. Perhaps most revealing is what is missing from the historical record. There are no verified casualty statistics linking shotgun use to Japanese losses. There are no Japanese protests, diplomatic complaints, or doctrinal adjustments in response to shotguns, unlike reactions to other controversial weapons earlier in the war. And notably, some of the most famous Marine memoirs from the Pacific, including those of Eugene Sledge and Robert Leckie, make no mention of shotguns at all. This absence is not accidental. It reflects the reality that shotguns were not primary assault weapons dominating combat, but specialized tools used in limited roles: perimeter defense, jungle patrols, guard duty, and close-in security. Understanding why Japanese troops feared American shotguns requires separating perception from practice and recognizing how myth can grow larger than the battlefield reality it claims to describe. From a purely technical standpoint, the Winchester Model 1897 and Model 1912 offered capabilities that appeared well suited to the brutal conditions of Pacific jungle warfare. Both were pump-action shotguns chambered in 12-gauge, firing buckshot that required minimal precision at close range. The Model 1897, in particular, possessed a feature that later became central to its reputation: slam fire. With the trigger held down, a trained operator could fire as fast as the pump could be cycled, potentially discharging 6 rounds in roughly 2 seconds. In confined spaces, this created an impression of overwhelming firepower. Against an enemy accustomed to bolt-action rifles with slower rates of fire, the shotgun seemed to represent a dramatic escalation in lethality at close range. This perception, however, often ignored the weapon's severe limitations, which shaped how, and how rarely, it was actually used in combat. Shotguns were brutally effective only within a narrow envelope. Their effective range was limited to a few dozen meters at best, often far less in dense foliage. Beyond that, accuracy and lethality dropped rapidly. Ammunition was bulky and heavy, reducing how much could be carried compared to rifle rounds. Reloading was slow, requiring individual shells rather than detachable magazines or stripper clips. More critically, reliability in the Pacific environment was a constant problem. Early shotgun shells used paper hulls, which absorbed moisture in humid jungle conditions. These shells swelled, jammed, and misfed, sometimes rendering the weapon useless in the middle of combat. This was not a minor inconvenience, it was a fundamental obstacle. Marines quickly learned that a jammed shotgun in a jungle firefight could be more dangerous than no weapon at all. As a result, shotguns were often reserved for static or semi-static roles where ammunition could be protected and maintenance controlled. The long-awaited solution came in the form of the brass-cased M19 shotgun shell, which resisted moisture and functioned reliably in tropical conditions. But this fix arrived far too late to shape the battles most often associated with shotgun mythology. The M19 shell entered production in March 1945, near the very end of the Pacific War. By then, campaigns like Guadalcanal, Cape Gloucester, Peleliu, and even much of Okinawa had already been fought. For the majority of the war, shotgun deployment remained constrained by logistics rather than enthusiasm. Authorization documents might list hundreds of shotguns per division, but actual availability varied wildly depending on supply chains, unit priorities, and terrain. This gap between capability and practicality explains much about how fear surrounding shotguns developed. Japanese troops did not encounter shotguns frequently enough to generate systematic countermeasures, but they encountered them often enough to recognize their potential danger in specific circumstances. A sudden close-range encounter with a shotgun-wielding Marine during a patrol or perimeter defense could be shocking and lethal. But these moments were isolated, not representative of broader combat patterns. Fear, in this case, did not stem from sustained battlefield dominance. It arose from the unpredictability of the weapon's appearance and the uncertainty of how to respond when it did appear. Equally important is what the shotgun did not replace. Rifles remained the backbone of American infantry firepower. Submachine guns, though limited in number, were more reliable and versatile for close combat. Machine guns and grenades dominated defensive engagements. Shotguns filled a niche, not a role of dominance. Their technical characteristics made them intimidating in theory and occasionally devastating in practice, but unsuitable for widespread offensive use. Understanding this distinction is critical. The fear Japanese troops associated with American shotguns was real, but it was rooted in isolated encounters, unfamiliar mechanics, and psychological surprise rather than consistent battlefield impact. The weapon's legend grew precisely because it was rare, specialized, and poorly understood by those who faced it. Contrary to popular portrayals, American shotguns were not commonly carried by assault troops storming Japanese positions. Their real value lay in specialized, often defensive roles where their limitations could be managed and their strengths exploited. Marine units most frequently assigned shotguns to perimeter defense, jungle patrols, and guard duty around command posts, supply dumps, airfields, and artillery positions. In these environments, engagement distances were short, reaction time mattered more than precision, and encounters were often sudden and chaotic. A Marine standing watch at night, armed with a shotgun, could respond instantly to infiltration attempts without the need for careful aiming. This made the weapon particularly useful against Japanese night tactics, which relied on stealth, surprise, and close-range attacks. In these specific circumstances, the shotgun's psychological impact far exceeded its statistical contribution to enemy casualties. Jungle patrols represented another niche where shotguns occasionally appeared. Dense foliage limited visibility to just a few meters, and contact with the enemy was often abrupt. In such encounters, a shotgun's ability to deliver immediate stopping power without precise sight alignment could be decisive. However, these patrols were typically small and irregular, and shotguns were far from standard issue. Many patrol leaders preferred rifles or submachine guns for their versatility and reliability. Shotguns were often carried by a single individual within a patrol rather than issued broadly. This limited distribution meant that Japanese troops encountered them sporadically, reinforcing the sense of unpredictability. A weapon that appeared rarely but produced a dramatic effect when it did appear tended to leave a stronger impression than one encountered routinely. This selective use helps explain why Japanese forces never developed formal countermeasures or doctrinal responses to American shotguns. Military adaptation requires repetition and pattern recognition. Japanese units adjusted tactics in response to artillery, air power, armor, and amphibious operations, because these threats were encountered consistently across multiple campaigns. Shotguns did not meet that threshold. They were not used in sufficient numbers nor with enough regularity to warrant changes in training manuals or tactical doctrine. There are no known Japanese field instructions addressing shotgun threats, no captured documents outlining specific responses, and no recorded complaints or protests concerning their use. This absence is telling. It suggests that while individual encounters could be frightening, the weapon did not fundamentally alter Japanese operational thinking. The lack of Japanese countermeasures also highlights a key reason the shotgun's reputation grew disproportionately large. Fear does not always correlate with frequency. In fact, rare weapons can inspire more anxiety precisely because they are unpredictable. Japanese soldiers knew what to expect from rifles, grenades, and machine guns. They understood their ranges, rhythms, and limitations. Shotguns, by contrast, defied familiar patterns. Their sound, effect at close range, and rapid rate of fire created a sense of sudden, overwhelming force, even if such encounters were isolated. This psychological shock was amplified by jungle conditions, darkness, and the stress of constant threat. Equally important is the silence of American frontline memoirs on the subject. Writers like Eugene Sledge and Robert Leckie meticulously described weapons that shaped their daily survival: mortars, artillery, machine guns, grenades. The near-total absence of shotguns in these accounts suggests that they were not central to sustained combat experience. When a weapon is decisive, it appears repeatedly in first-hand narratives. Shotguns do not. Instead, their presence lingers at the margins of the historical record, surfacing in authorization tables, logistical reports, and occasional anecdotes. This marginality is key to understanding both their real role and their exaggerated reputation. Shotguns did not dominate Pacific combat. They existed on its edges, and it was from those edges that fear, rumor, and myth began to grow. One of the most striking aspects of the shotgun's reputation in the Pacific War is the complete absence of reliable casualty data linking it to Japanese losses. Unlike artillery, machine guns, or even flamethrowers, shotguns never appear in after-action reports as a distinct category of battlefield lethality. American unit records tracked casualties by engagement, sector, and weapon system when relevant, yet shotguns are almost entirely invisible in these summaries. This is not because their effects were deliberately hidden or censored, but because their use was too limited and inconsistent to register as a measurable factor. In large-scale battles involving thousands of men, a weapon carried by a handful of individuals in peripheral roles simply did not generate data significant enough to record separately. As a result, there is no statistical foundation supporting the idea that shotguns inflicted disproportionate casualties or fundamentally altered the balance of close combat. This absence of data is mirrored on the Japanese side. Japanese military records, field reports, and post-war analyses make no specific mention of shotguns as a recurring or decisive threat. There are no known documents identifying shotgun fire as a cause of significant losses, no tactical bulletins warning troops to adapt to their use, and no evidence of changes in Japanese infantry doctrine in response. This silence is critical. The Imperial Japanese Army was meticulous in documenting threats that demanded adaptation. When confronted with new American tactics or weapons, from improved amphibious assaults to armored flamethrowers, Japanese planners responded with revised defensive concepts. Shotguns prompted no such response. This strongly suggests that while individual encounters may have been shocking, they did not occur frequently enough to shape operational thinking. Understanding this gap between perception and documentation is essential to separating myth from reality. Fear in combat does not require statistical dominance. It requires surprise and unfamiliarity. A sudden, close-range encounter with a shotgun could be terrifying, especially in jungle conditions where visibility was limited and reaction time was measured in seconds. Such moments were memorable precisely because they were rare. Human memory tends to exaggerate exceptional events while overlooking routine ones. Over time, these isolated incidents were retold, generalized, and gradually transformed into a narrative of widespread battlefield impact. The absence of hard data allowed this process to continue unchecked, particularly after the war, when popular culture began to fill the gaps left by incomplete records. The contrast between authorized weapons and actual combat use further complicates the picture. Marine Corps documents might list hundreds of shotguns assigned to a division, but authorization did not equate to deployment. Weapons could be held in reserve, assigned to rear area units, or rendered unusable by ammunition shortages and environmental conditions. Many shotguns never left storage, while others were issued briefly and then withdrawn due to reliability problems. Without consistent frontline use, there was little opportunity for the weapon to leave a statistical footprint. This disconnect between paperwork and battlefield reality is a recurring theme in military history, and the shotgun is a textbook example. The myth of the shotgun as a dominant Pacific War weapon thrives largely because it occupies a narrative vacuum. It is dramatic, intuitive, and easy to visualize. A close-range weapon in jungle combat fits neatly into popular assumptions about the war. But history is rarely so tidy. The lack of casualty statistics, the silence of official records, and the absence of first-hand emphasis in major memoirs all point to the same conclusion. Shotguns did not shape Pacific battles in a measurable way. Their reputation grew not from data, but from anecdote, imagination, and the human tendency to amplify the unusual. Recognizing this does not diminish the fear they inspired in isolated encounters. It simply places that fear where it belongs, at the margins of a much larger and more complex war. Some of the most influential accounts of the Pacific War were written not by historians, but by the men who fought it. Memoirs like With the Old Breed by Eugene Sledge and Helmet for My Pillow by Robert Leckie have shaped how generations understand jungle warfare, fear, and survival. These books are rich in detail, describing weapons, sounds, routines, and the constant presence of death with an immediacy unmatched by official reports. Yet within these detailed narratives, one weapon is conspicuously absent: the shotgun. Sledge and Leckie describe rifles, machine guns, mortars, grenades, flamethrowers, artillery, and naval gunfire in vivid terms. They recount how these weapons shaped their daily existence and defined the dangers they faced. The absence of shotguns in such comprehensive accounts is not an oversight. It is a strong indicator that shotguns were not central to the lived combat experience of most Marines in the Pacific. This silence matters because frontline memoirs tend to emphasize what was frequent, not what was rare. Weapons that repeatedly affected survival, mortars landing at random, machine guns pinning down advances, artillery pulverizing positions, dominate these narratives because they were constant threats. Shotguns, by contrast, appear only at the margins of the war. When a weapon is used sporadically in specific roles and by a limited number of personnel, it is unlikely to leave a lasting imprint on collective memory. This helps explain why even Marines who fought through multiple campaigns could complete entire memoirs without mentioning shotguns at all. Their war was defined by endurance under bombardment, the terror of unseen snipers, and the grinding exhaustion of repeated assaults, not by dramatic close-range encounters with smoothbore weapons. The contrast becomes even clearer when examining what veterans did choose to emphasize. Close combat, when described, almost always centers on grenades, bayonets, automatic weapons, and flamethrowers. These were the tools that shaped assaults on bunkers and caves, the moments when men felt most vulnerable and most lethal. Flamethrowers, in particular, are frequently described because of their unmistakable psychological impact and consistent use in specific battles. Shotguns never occupied a comparable role. They were not part of standard assault doctrine, nor were they issued widely enough to become a shared experience. As a result, they failed to enter the core narrative of Pacific combat as told by those who lived it. This gap between popular imagination and veteran testimony helps explain how shotgun mythology took root after the war. When first-hand accounts do not provide dramatic stories about a particular weapon, space is created for speculation and exaggeration. Later retellings, secondary sources, and popular media filled that space, often projecting modern assumptions about close-quarters lethality backward onto a historical context where they did not fully apply. Over time, the absence of contradiction allowed the myth to harden. Few readers questioned why the most detailed Marine memoirs omitted such a supposedly fearsome weapon. Understanding what veterans did not say is as important as understanding what they did. Silence in historical sources is not empty, it is informative. In this case, it suggests that shotguns, while real and occasionally effective, were not decisive, common, or central to how Marines experienced combat. The fear Japanese troops may have felt in isolated encounters does not translate into widespread battlefield significance. The men who survived the Pacific War remembered what shaped their days and nights. Shotguns, for most of them, simply did not. On paper, the U.S. Marine Corps appeared well-equipped with shotguns. Authorization tables show that a standard Marine division was allocated roughly 306 shotguns, a number that seems to support the idea of widespread deployment. But wartime authorization did not equal battlefield presence. Divisions were constantly reorganized, equipment was redistributed based on immediate needs, and weapons competed for limited shipping space across thousands of miles of ocean. Priority was given to rifles, machine guns, mortars, and artillery, weapons that defined modern infantry combat. Shotguns, bulky and dependent on specialized ammunition, often fell lower on the logistical hierarchy. Many were stored in rear areas, assigned to base security units, or never issued at all. Others were distributed briefly and then withdrawn when ammunition problems or maintenance issues made them impractical for frontline use. This disconnect between authorization and employment was not unusual. The Pacific War placed extreme strain on supply chains, and commanders had to make constant decisions about what was worth carrying into combat. Shotgun ammunition was heavier and less efficient to transport than rifle rounds. A Marine could carry far fewer shells than cartridges for an M1 Garand or a Springfield rifle, reducing sustained combat effectiveness. Additionally, shotguns required careful protection from moisture, especially before the introduction of reliable brass-cased shells. In jungle environments where weapons were constantly exposed to rain, mud, and humidity, this vulnerability mattered. As a result, even when shotguns were available, commanders often chose not to issue them widely. Practical considerations outweighed theoretical advantages. From a doctrinal standpoint, the Marine Corps never envisioned shotguns as primary assault weapons. Training manuals and tactical doctrine emphasized combined arms, fire, and maneuver, and the coordinated use of rifles, automatic weapons, and supporting fires. Shotguns were viewed as specialty tools, useful in guarding prisoners, securing perimeters, or patrolling areas where sudden close contact was likely. They were not intended to replace rifles or submachine guns in offensive operations. This doctrinal reality shaped how the weapon was perceived and used. A weapon that is not integrated into core tactics rarely becomes decisive, no matter how effective it might be in isolation. This helps explain why Japanese troops encountered shotguns inconsistently. One unit might face them during a night infiltration attempt near a marine perimeter, while another might fight an entire campaign without seeing one at all. Such uneven exposure fuels rumor and exaggeration. When a weapon appears unexpectedly and produces a dramatic effect, it can leave a lasting impression disproportionate to its actual prevalence. For Japanese soldiers accustomed to predictable patterns of fire, the shotgun's sudden appearance, loud, violent, and unfamiliar, could be genuinely frightening. But fear born of surprise does not automatically translate into strategic significance. The industrial side of the story reinforces this conclusion. Although tens of thousands of Model 1897 and Model 1912 shotguns were produced for military service, production numbers alone do not indicate frontline impact. Many of these weapons served stateside, guarded bases, or were held in reserve. Others were issued late in the war, after major Pacific campaigns had already concluded. The arrival of reliable M19 brass-cased ammunition in March 1945 came too late to reshape doctrine or alter outcomes in earlier battles. By the time logistical and technical problems were largely solved, the war was nearing its end. In this light, the fear associated with American shotguns becomes easier to understand and easier to contextualize. Japanese troops feared what they did not fully understand, especially when it appeared suddenly and violently in close quarters. But fear alone does not define battlefield reality. The limited deployment of shotguns, their marginal role in doctrine, and their logistical shortcomings all constrained their influence. The weapon existed in a gray zone between potential and practice. It was authorized, produced, and occasionally effective, but rarely decisive. Recognizing this distinction is essential to understanding why shotguns loom large in modern imagination while remaining faint in the actual records of Pacific War combat. The gap between historical reality and popular belief surrounding American shotguns in the Pacific did not emerge during the war itself, but in the decades that followed. As World War II faded from living memory, complex operational realities were increasingly replaced by simplified narratives. Close-quarters jungle fighting became a dominant image of the Pacific War, and the shotgun fit that image perfectly. It was intuitive, visually dramatic, and easy to understand without technical explanation. Films, novels, and later video games amplified this portrayal, often presenting shotguns as common frontline weapons that routinely devastated Japanese infantry. These depictions rarely cited primary sources, instead reinforcing each other through repetition. Over time, the absence of contradiction allowed assumption to harden into perceived fact. The shotgun became a symbol rather than a documented tool. Hollywood played a decisive role in this transformation. War films favored weapons that communicated brutality and immediacy on screen, and few weapons achieved this as effectively as the shotgun. A single blast could be visually and emotionally decisive, requiring little context for the audience to grasp its impact. The realities of ammunition shortages, limited deployment, and doctrinal marginality did not translate well to cinematic storytelling. As a result, shotguns were elevated far beyond their historical role. Later media followed the same pattern. Video games and popular histories often treated shotguns as standard equipment for American troops, reinforcing the idea that Japanese soldiers regularly faced them in combat. Each retelling added another layer of certainty, even as the underlying evidence remained thin. This process illustrates how myths can form in the absence of data. Unlike artillery or armored warfare, shotguns left little statistical footprint. There were no casualty tables to contradict exaggerated claims, no after-action reports highlighting their limited use, and no Japanese doctrinal responses to anchor discussion in documented reaction. In this vacuum, storytelling filled the gaps. The rarity of shotguns in actual combat paradoxically made them more memorable when they did appear in anecdote. A single shocking encounter could be retold many times, detached from its original context and gradually generalized into a broader truth. Over time, the distinction between occasionally encountered and widely used blurred. What makes this myth particularly resilient is that it aligns neatly with modern expectations of warfare. Today's audiences are accustomed to seeing shotguns as dominant close-quarters weapons shaped by contemporary policing, military use, and entertainment media. Projecting this modern understanding backward onto World War II feels natural, even though it ignores the technological and logistical realities of the time. The Pacific War was defined by rifles, machine guns, mortars, artillery, and naval firepower, not by smoothbore weapons. Yet the shotgun persists in popular imagination because it offers a simple explanation for fear in jungle combat. It reduces a complex battlefield to a single visceral image. Recognizing this does not mean dismissing the fear Japanese troops may have felt during isolated encounters. Fear was real, but it was situational, not systemic. The problem arises when that fear is transformed into a narrative of widespread battlefield dominance unsupported by evidence. History becomes distorted not through deliberate falsehood, but through repetition of incomplete stories. The shotgun myth survives because it is rarely challenged and easy to believe. Correcting it requires patience, context, and a willingness to accept that reality is often less dramatic than legend. By understanding how this myth formed, we gain insight into a broader truth about military history. Weapons do not become famous solely because of what they do on the battlefield, but because of how they are remembered afterward. The American shotgun in the Pacific War became iconic not through consistent combat use, but through cultural reinforcement long after the fighting ended. Separating myth from record is not about diminishing the experience of those who fought. It is about honoring it accurately. What ultimately separates myth from history is consistency. Decisive weapons leave traces everywhere. In doctrine, in memoirs, in casualty reports, in enemy responses. Shotguns leave almost none of these marks. They appear in authorization tables, production figures, and occasional anecdotes, but vanish from the core documentation of combat. Japanese records do not reflect concern or adjustment. American frontline memoirs barely mention them. No reliable statistics link them to significant battlefield outcomes. This silence is not an accident, it is evidence. It shows that while shotguns existed and were sometimes effective, they did not shape how battles were fought or won. Their reputation grew later, amplified by cultural storytelling rather than wartime experience. The endurance of this myth reveals something deeper about how war is remembered. Audiences gravitate toward weapons that feel personal, immediate, and brutal, tools that seem to compress the chaos of battle into a single, understandable image. The shotgun fits that mold perfectly. It is easy to imagine, easy to dramatize, and easy to project backward onto a conflict already defined by harsh conditions and close combat. But history resists simplicity. The Pacific War was decided by logistics, industrial capacity, artillery, naval power, air superiority, and infantry endurance measured over months and years, not by isolated encounters with niche weapons. Understanding this does not diminish the experiences of those who fought. On the contrary, it respects them by refusing to replace complexity with legend. Fear existed on both sides, shaped by uncertainty, exhaustion, and the constant threat of death. Japanese troops feared many things: bombardment they could not escape, flamethrowers that invaded their tunnels, artillery that fell without warning, and enemies who never seemed to stop advancing. Shotguns were a small part of that landscape, memorable when encountered, but not decisive. In the end, the story of American shotguns in the Pacific is not about how deadly they were, but about how easily perception can outgrow reality. It shows how authorization does not guarantee use, how production does not equal impact, and how memory can distort scale. By separating fear from effect, myth from record, we gain a clearer understanding of the war as it was actually fought. That clarity matters, because history deserves to be remembered not as legend, but as lived experience. complex, uneven, and far more instructive than any simplified story ever could be.